Hello and welcome to another Intro to Programming and Database tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be solving the fourth assignment for this week, which is about the arrays. And in this case, we have a two-dimensional array. Now, the two-dimensional arrays are mostly used to store tabular data. For example, here we have multiple scores of multiple students. Or if you have multiple sales of multiple sales representatives. So those are the kind of situations where you want to use a two-dimensional array. So anything that you would want to represent in a table comprising of rows and columns, that probably should go in a two-dimensional array. So here we have the score of 5 different students and 5 scores of 3 different students. So what we have are 3 students that we're going to be represented as 3 separate rows in an array. And we have 5 scores of each students. So here we're going to be declaring our two-dimensional array of scores. Now, a single-dimensional array was pretty much declared like this. However, a two-dimensional array, we're going to have a comma here between, so that to show you that there are 2 dimensions. There is a dimension before the comma, and then there is a dimension after the comma. When you are actually storing the scores of students, you probably can use, again, the opening and closing curly braces to represent the values, but now we can have total of 3 sets of curly braces. Each set of curly braces will represent one of the 3 students. So these are the curly braces for the first student, these are the curly braces for the second student, and these are the curly braces for the third student. So since we have a total of 3 students. Each student has 5 scores, so each of the curly braces will going to store 5 different scores. So let's put 5 different scores for each one of them. Let me spread it out so that when I'm putting in 5 different scores for each of the student, it will going to be a little bit readable as compared to what it is right now. So let's say I entered some of the scores, 80, 75, 90, 100, and 67. These are the 5 scores for the first student. 88, 56, 89, 7, 90, and 76. And for the last student, 100, 90, 87. So this is how you go about declaring a multi-dimensional array, which has 3 rows, because each row represents 1 student, and each student has 5 scores. So if I had to represent sales done by 5 salespeople, then each record will be for each salesperson, and the sales done will going to be the values within that row. So now we need to accomplish the other set of tasks, which are display the sum and average of all scores for each student. So I need to have an accumulator that will add up all the scores for a student and display them. And also, I need to display the average of scores of all students. And then I also need to make sure that there is a sum, which is an accumulator for all the scores for all the students and the average of all 3 of the students' scores. So I need to display a sum and average per student, and I need to display a sum and average for all students for their scores. So for that purpose, we're going to be needing some of these variables. So let's declare a sum for students, which will going to be a total sum, and going to be a sum per student as double. I could declare all 4 variables of the same line, but for the readability purpose, I'm declaring them in different lines. So we have an average for students, and we have an average per student. Now we need to traverse through this two-dimensional array. So now to traverse through a two-dimensional array, we need to have a nested loop. We need to have the outer loop reading 1 record at a time or 1 row at a time, and the inner loop to go through each one of the elements in that row. So since we have total of 3 rows, so we can actually have rows as integer going from 0 to 2. So that's a total of 3 rows. And then we can have columns as integer, which we're going to go from 0 to 4 because there are 4 scores in each row. So this will going to give me my table-like look and feel. So I have 3 rows, 0 to 2, 0, 1, and 2. That adds up to 3. And 0 to 4, which is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, total of 5 scores in every record. Now I need to traverse through and add the sum of all the scores for each student. So for that purpose, in my sum students, sorry, sum per student, because this is sum per student, I need to be able to calculate the sum of all the scores for that student. Now, this nested loop is going to work pretty much like this. So first time I run my loop, so the value of rows is 0, the value of columns is 0. So 0, 0 will read this score, which is 80. Then rows will stay 0, but column will now become 1. So 0th row, first column. Then row will stay 0. Now I'm going to move to the next column. Row will remain 0, we're going to move to the next column. Row will remain 0, we're going to move to the next column. When it's done with all 5 of the columns in the first row, then the counter will, for the rows, will going to be incremented by 1, and we're going to shift to the next line. So now we are going to read one by one all 5 values in the next line. Then we're going to read the 5 values in the line below. So this is how it's pretty much circumventing through this process. So after we add up all the scores for a student, we can calculate the average per student outside of the first loop, which is average per student is the sum per student divided by 5, because there are 5 scores per student. And then also what we can do is we can add the sum per students to the sum of all students. So we are adding the sum of the student that we have just calculated to the accumulator, which is the sum of all the students. So every time we come out of the inner loop, we will have a sum of all the scores for a student. Then we're going to add that to an accumulator, which will be the sum for all the students. So this process will continue. Now what we need to do extra over here is that sum per student must be set back to 0. So that when we are back in the loop, we need to calculate the sum per student for the next student. We need to start from 0. Otherwise, every student score will be sum of all the previous scores from all the previous students and then the current student scores. We don't want to do that. So to avoid that, we need to set the sum per student to 0. Now, what else we need to do over here is we need to display. We're just calculating. We're not displaying anything yet. So we need to add the display logic. So after we calculate the sum per student, before we set it to 0, we can simply display system.console.writeLine score sum per student. Now, we can also display the number, whichever number we are displaying. So sum score, this is the rows, the value for rows, and another concatenation. So this will going to display score sum, the row number, colon, and then the sum. Similarly, we can take the same line and we can copy it and paste it right below average per student, and we can just simply display score average, whichever row number we want to do, and this is the average per student. Then outside of the outer loop, we need to calculate and display the sum of all the students and the average of all the students. So this is where we can say, okay, score sum of all, and this is where you're displaying some students. And now we need to calculate the average students. Now notice the average students will be calculated as the sum students divided by 15 and not 5. The reason is because in some students there are a total of 15 scores, not 5. So it needs to be divided by the total quantity of scores stored inside. So that is why we're dividing it by 15 and not 5, because it is the sum of 15 scores, 5 taken from each student. So now we have score average of all students as AVG students. So now when we run this program, we should be able to see our output, which pretty much displays the sum of the first student, the average, the sum of the second student, the average, the sum of the third student, the average, and the sum of all students and the average of all students. So this is basically what was required of you to get done in this assignment. I know it had a lot of process. Let's review this again. We have a two-dimensional array that stores the 5 scores of 3 students. So we have one row dedicated to each student. Then we declared 2 variables, one to store the sum of all the scores of all the students, and one to store the sum of all the scores for each student. Then we had an average students, which we're going to be used to calculate the average of all students, and average per student to calculate the average per student. Now we created a nested loop. The outer loop to go through all the students' records, and the inner loop to go through the scores for each student. So we're going to first read all the scores of one student before we go about reading all the scores for the next student. Every time we read a score for a student, we will going to add it to a sum per student. So this will going to be an accumulator or the running total of the current student. Outside of the inner loop, we'll display this. We'll calculate the average per student. We'll display the average per student. We're going to add the sum per student to a grand accumulator, which is the accumulator for all the scores sum. And we're going to set the sum per student to back to 0 so that the next student's sum is calculated starting from 0. And then outside of the outer loop, we will going to display the sum of all the students. We'll calculate the average of scores of all the students and display it to the user. Hope you would have enjoyed this tutorial. Catch you in the next.